Hi all, so today we come back on the Carolingians, and especially on the time of the late Carolingian dynasty and the progressive political decline of and fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire itself. I already made a video on the partition of Carolingian Europe that touched partly these topics, but it was mostly focused on observing the cultural and linguistical differences of the various populations that made up the empire, and that incidentally came to be corresponding in the respective areas to the eventual blocks in which the Carolingian Empire split. Today I would like to focus a little bit more instead on the political history of this disgregation, or at least trying to follow how basically imperial rule and this symbol of the unity of the empire came to be torn apart during the same Carolingian times up to the end with Charles III, better known as Charles the Fat. So as we know, and you can see that evidently from this from the map that here it's presented, we could divide in part the Carolingian Empire on the base of cultural linguistical differences, as we were saying in the other video. An eastern area that corresponded roughly to modern days western and southern Germany, inhabited by in fact mostly Germanic peoples, and a western and southern area that comprehends roughly today's France and Italy, that instead was inhabited by Romance populations. But the Carolingians with the Treaty of Verdun actually split up the empire in three parts, as we know, forming this channel in between the Germanic area and the French area, let's say, better known as Lotharingia, because it was given among the three brothers that split the empire to Lauter. And we're gonna discuss especially that in this video, because this central part kept after the division the imperial dignity in many ways, because the point was that there wasn't any collegial empire in the Carolingian mindset. As we have often said when talking about the Franks, whether they were Merovingian or Carolingian, the Franks had a very low public, let's say they had a very scarce sense of public authority in their political manners. They considered the Frankish Empire as something that belonged to them privately, that was owned in full property, not just because they were kings or later emperors, but because they had deserved those lands, and that therefore they had to belong fully to them, according to the ancient Germanic belief that what the warrior conquers belongs in fact to the warrior. But here, at least in the in the myth of the 9th century about which we are talking, the idea of the imperial of the imperial authority, sanctioned by the way by the relations with the Pope, who had crowned the dynasty, etc., was too seducing to be abandoned and to even be conceived in collegial terms. After all, the ancient Romans had split the empire at a certain point by having a collegial, concept of the empire, in the sense that there was a Western emperor and an Eastern emperor. Instead, the Franks, and this is interesting in this perspective, kept the centrality of the imperial rule in the hands only of one man, who was Lauter, in fact. And this shows, and which is quite interesting, the persistent will for unity that this empire, though it was really starting to crumble, seemingly wanted to retain for itself, because it was obviously a matter of prestige. It would be interesting to think also how the Franks conceived themselves in relation with Constantinople. The unity of their empire was a very important point to stress in order to prove their newly acquired Roman imperial authority. And as we have said also in the other video, Lotharingia owned, which was a very apparently irrational division, because as we have seen, it encompassed areas that were quite different from each other. If you look at here the area of Frisia and the areas comprehended between today France and Germany, and then Burgundy, and then central and northern Italy. I mean, they didn't have such a very strong compactness as territories. As we will be seeing, they wouldn't hold for much. But there was a very important symbolism into this, because Lotharingia was created in a way that it could keep imperial rule ideologically through the existence within its borders of the two capitals of the empire, let's say. The one in the south, that was Rome, and that was indeed, the most prestigious one, not because it was a Carolingian capital at all. The papacy retained control over Rome. The Carolingians essentially just protecting it, and and letting it autonomous. But also in the north of the Alps, the at least the attempt of a properly Carolingian capital, that is today's Aachen. Aachen was built by Charles the Great, trying to emulate Rome herself. So he spent a big deal of money to build this city that was conceived to he needs expectations to last as a lasting city, in fact, which is very meaningful, because it tells you how much Charles the Great and Louis the Pious conceived strongly this idea of Roman continuity in the Roman Empire, and especially this public authority that they were trying to impose in order to contrast the private political ambitions of the Carolingian counts, and considering especially that the same Carolingians, just like the Merovingians, hadn't had a capital proper. There were a lot of cities in the empire, mostly of Roman origin, and however, the Frankish dynasties had always preferred to live into these rural mansions that were really mansions. They weren't really cities on their own, but complexes of country houses, very large, very rich in many ways, but that were conceived as merely as residences. We haven't the time to explain why this happened, but let's just say that in the High Middle Ages, the Carolingian kings were quite itinerant, and therefore they preferred to have these scattered residences all over the empire rather than having a center from which, however, they couldn't control the very vast areas that they at least nominally speaking, ruled. So Aachen, which is a beautiful city indeed, you can see that if you go to Germany, it's in the northwest, close to the Netherlands, the Dutch border, still has Charles Palace, the Palatine Chapel. It's a beautiful city, but let's say that the will of Charles the Great to make it the capital of the centralized capital of an empire definitely failed. You know, it remained an important city during the Middle Ages, but it really didn't play any great political importance. And for the reason that the same idea of Lotharingia, the same Carolingian Empire eventually faded. However, it's important to conceive these two capitals of the empire in the unitary attempt of the Carolingians within their own empire. However, as we were saying, this irrational territorial asset of Lotharingia would soon fade. At the death of Lauter the First emperor, Carolingian emperor, in 855, his inheritance were split between his two sons. He had two sons, Lothar and Ludwig. Lothar, that we used to call Lothar II as king of, and we don't have a name of this kingdom. This is pretty weird, because really he inherited the northern part of Lotharingia, the one north of the Alps, essentially. So he had this kingdom that really didn't have a name. It remained anonymous, and that tells you how, you know, pragmatical these partitions were conceived by, politically speaking. They were just kind of I don't know, of sops. I don't know how to say that, for keeping these Carolingians satisfied with their own ambitions, relatively to, you know, their siblings, their brothers at least, and at the point that they wouldn't even be conceiving them as kingdoms proper. And this is not entirely true, as we will be seeing, but definitely this northern part of Lotharingia never made it to be something even close to a kingdom, while the Western Francia and Eastern Francia would become kingdoms with great difficulty over some time, and Italy and Burgundy retained their own former, respectively Longobarд and Burgundian, political unity, even though they also eventually underwent a process of fragmentation. Well, this northern part of Lotharingia remained nameless, or better, it kind of was eventually an area from which the modern region of Lorraine in France actually takes its name, but that is all because of this region that comprehended, you know, the territories of from Frisia to Alsace. Alsace excluded, by the way, were called Lotharingia in a way in remembrance of this Lothar II, but eventually he didn't make it to be a kingdom practically, and it tended to remain just a name. and even the same populations that inhabited it were partly Germanic, partly Romance. So there was really a very inconsistent character of this reputation. The other son of Lothar I, and more precisely his firstborn son, Ludwig, that took the name of Ludwig II as emperor of the Carolingian Empire, and he took his name from his grandfather, Louis the Pious, and he had already been associated by his father to the imperial dignity and to the kingship of the Kingdom of Italy. And when his father died, he maintained both, essentially, because he was emperor, and at the same time he was king of Italy, and he ruled from there, from the ancient Langobarд capital Pavia. So, and Ludwig II is, in a certain sense, probably, I don't know, it's my favorite among all these fellows, because he was really busy, into his life, trying to make of the Italian kingdom something, unitary and strong. While Eastern and Western Francia were progressively and in partly already tearing apart by themselves, or at least they were divided, and they gave some troubles to many, and there was a sort of Germanic idea of politics from where it was the local nobility that they elected and supported actively the royal policies. Italy was a very different kingdom from all the others, because Italy had, traditionally speaking, under the Longobards, a very strong and centralized public administration. So it was a place that, together, because of his wealth and strategical position, had a very crucial importance. It had, in fact, the same papal dominions within it. So it bordered with part of the Byzantine territories. So it was quite important from there for a monarch of this point to try to establish something more unitary on a smaller base than the big empire that was evidently very difficult to put once again together because of these divisions among the various Carolingians, but that at the same time was more rational and more fruitful, at least at a first glance. And I'd say that Ludwig, in this sense, was very firm, very, very firm in the administration of the Italic kingdom. He obviously always wore this, figure of the protector of Rome because of that, and also of the Longobards of southern Italy. This is quite interesting. The Longobards of southern Italy were essentially a client state of the Carolingians at this time. The Longobards, the Carolingians had conquered essentially the Longobard kingdom of the north, but the duchy of Benevent had remained out of direct Carolingian rule. The duchy, by the way, would transform itself into a princedom at a point. So just to tell you how autonomous they grew, and especially the Longobard duchy of Benevent was bordering the Byzantine avamposts of southern Italy. So they were very important strategically speaking, because they were a bit client of the Carolingians and of the Byzantines at the same time. And it was that of southern Italy was a very important area, also exactly because of sea power and the control of the east. The Carolingians were largely a terrestrial power at the time, but it's obvious that if you rule a peninsula like the Italian one, and you have the Byzantine imperial fleet that can attack you from the Adriatic or the Tyrrhenian seas, you would think twice, not to care about a political player like the Langobards of Benevent, in order to assure you some kind of fealty from them. And it's also very important to mention that Ludwig II harshly fought against the Saracens that already at that time were hitting the Italian coasts and eventually even invading the same Italian mainland at a point. The Saracens, as we know, were these pirates that were really they really didn't fit within the Islamic Emirates at this point. Were this kind of piracy coming largely from North Africa, Spain, and Sicily, that at this point begins to hit the Carolingian world from the south. Even southern France and the Spanish mark were assaulted by the Spanish mark and Navarre especially were on the Umayyad frontier in Spain with the Carolingians, and therefore there was this very energetic, a very continuous and very determined effort from Ludwig II to carry out these military expeditions against the invaders, and to try in this process to make the whole royal administration work. As I was saying before, the Longobards had left in spite of the crisis of the very last phase of their kingdom, a substantially pretty good centralized administration. And yet the Carolingian conquest hadn't been such a very light event on the affairs of Italy, so that a bit of damage was done, and Ludwig in this sense tried instead to keep public authority working through its traditional channels, and one of which was in fact the call to arms. And Ludwig II campaigns in central and southern Italy are very interesting, even from a strictly military the point of view of military history, and they were quite important also because they brought and they culminated in 871 with the destruction of the so-called Emirate of Bari. Bari is a city in Apulia, southeastern Italy. It's a place where the Saracens had kicked out the I don't remember whether it were the Byzantines or the Langobards of Benevent there, but it's where Bari was renownedly a very Greek-influenced city on the coast, and the Saracens had built an emirate there, and that was conceived as that was part of the Duchy of Benevent, geographically speaking. So even the intervention in this land makes you understand how close Ludwig came the southern Longobards to be integrated within the Carolingian sphere of influence, and how important it was to carry out such military operations there. And When we think, however, about the repartitions of Lotharingia, we should always remember also another little entity that was in the middle of the one split between Lothar II and Ludwig II. That was the one of the basin of the Rhone river in southern France, in Burgundy, essentially, and this would be given to a third son of Lothar I, whose name was Charles. You know, they tried to keep a pretty substantial homogeneity in their names, and this area would be given to this third brother, but it is that it was eventually split between Lothar II and Ludwig II. The events that occur after this repartition are pretty strange, if you want, because there is a last moment in Carolingian affairs that took place in a very short amount of time. Substantially, after a short while, a series of Carolingians die, and especially the legitimate male line, and you see that Charles the Bold, that had received Western Francia and that ruled there with all his problems, because during Charles the Bold was one of the sons of Charles the Great. He lived a very long time, telling the truth. He outlived basically almost of his nephews. In the Western Frankish kingdom, so today's France roughly, was already showing, in spite of a relatively easy political passage between the older Carolingians and Charles the Bold, a progress of disgregation. That is the one that will lead France, essentially before the Capetian dynasty, to be this extremely weak kingdom that could be also not be born as France eventually, and Charles was essentially struggling in France at this time, and he had already enough problems at home to bother his nephews in Italy or in Germany. But at a certain point, even Ludwig II dies, so it arose the problem of to whom had to be given imperial dignity. And Charles the Bold from France said, "Here, I want to take that." And there was a pretty harsh moment in which basically I think his brother Ludwig the German was still alive, but his son would go into Italy as well with the German army, and Charles was entering from Piedmont in Italy as well with his French army to fight over the imperial crown. And at that point, the two armies faced, and they came to an agreement that was also comforted by the papal decision to give the imperial dignity to Charles the Bold. And it wasn't much of a great proof of strength from Charles, but rather the contrary, because the powers involved substantially understood that Charles, even with his imperial title, couldn't carry out a policy of imperial scale. France was already a mess on its own. Charles was old. In fact, he would die substantially 2 years later. So everything was fine. The only problem is that at that point nobody seemed to have the strength to carry out an imperial policy on its own. However, there were minor adjustments in the partition of the Carolingian Empire at this point, because it's from this moment that Lotharingia, the northern Lotharingia, so those territories that as we have seen were between the Alps and Frisia, and that had belonged to Lothar the second, were inherited by the German side, essentially the Teutonic kingdom, called Kingdom of the Eastern Franks at this time, in order to stress, the Frankishness, or at least the fact that Germany at that point was a Frankish dominion, although it wasn't much of a Frankish land historically, and to distinguish also itself from the kingdom of the Western Franks, that was the one ruled at the time by Charles the Bold. And the point is that there are other deaths, as we have seen, including the one of Charles and the one of Ludwig, and etc. And at the end of the story is that by the 80s of the 9th century, of all the Carolingian dynasty, only Charles, son of Ludwig the German, was fit for inheriting the kingdom. So there is this paradoxical situation for which the Carolingians had fought against each other for taking everyone his own part and trying to making it, to pass it to their heirs, but there was at this point a unique Carolingian heir, this Charles, named Charles III, and better known as Charles the Fact, who was able to acquire, to get into his hand, not just imperial dignity, but all the various kingdoms into which the empire had been articulated in the last generations. But this also was something that lasted for a very short time, because Charles would be considered a weak sovereign. He was the one who essentially that paid. At this time, considered that the Carolingian Empire is under attack from the Vikings. At a certain point, Paris is under attack, so Charles has a very few power, but he's not a stupid man, and he decides to pay the Vikings to leave Paris. This is what they do. They take the Carolingian gold and they leave. But from a Frankish perspective, the idea of paying an enemy with gold to make it go away was kind of an insult, both for the Germanic ethos that they had, the idea that you don't pay an enemy to make him go away, you just kill him with your own sword, and also because of the same imperial Roman imperial ideals. There was this episode in the history of the Roman Republic where the Gauls essentially when the Romans that had their city sacked by the Gauls said we want to win our back our city with gold, as the Gauls wanted them to do at that point, to give them Rome back, but we're gonna retake it with iron, with the sword as well. But more pragmatically speaking, this was a very good excuse, politically speaking, to retake, political, let's say, to weaken Charles and to rise as new rulers, which is what which is the opportunity that an illegitimate son of Ludwig the German, Arnulf of Carinthia, definitely took. And this happened, by the way, because the Germanic aristocracy essentially pushed for it. They placed Arnulf in charge as king of the Eastern Francia, and he therefore rebelled to Charles III. And Charles is remembered as Charles the Fat, also because at the very end of his life, that would occur a few times later, regarding to the events narrated, was extremely obese, and he couldn't even move, etc. So that was seen always in Germanic perspective as a proof of the king's unfitness, to the emperor's unfitness to his office. And in fact, when Arnulf rebelled to Charles, he couldn't really do much, and it seems that all the nobility of the Frankish Empire at that point tried to pass from Arnulf's side to get new privileges, and essentially viewing in him as the next successor. And at the same time, it's interesting that 1 year after, in 888, that is the year in which, if I'm not wrong, even Charles died, the aristocracy of the Western Frankish kingdom, so the one that had belonged to Charles the Bald, elected to the throne a powerful vassal of the Carolingians, who was Otto, Count of Paris. From the counts of Paris, eventually even the Capetians would inherit, therefore, the royal power in Western Francia, and re-establishing eventually the royal power within the kingdom itself. So at this point, you see that the Carolingian Empire basically finished. This is the year in which we normally, conceive the end of the Carolingian Empire, and as in many times in history, it came essentially to finish in a very progressive way, in a very silent way, and what was left were essentially the same aristocracy that had participated to the Carolingian experiment, either as conquerors of other peoples or as conquered peoples, as a matter of fact. And in this sense, it's very important that the imperial dignity, aside from all, especially the Italic aristocrats who, being close to Rome, would regain nominally for their own, the true renewal of the empire would start from Saxony. That was, the Saxons had been the fiercest enemies of the Carolingians for many years, and eventually they were paradoxically the ones who inherited the Frankish imperial grandeur. I hope everything was clear. I like to stress a pair of concepts. I could have been more concise, but I think it's also nice to take time to make some reflections and take certain excursus just to deepen a bit the perspectives. So as always, I thank you for watching. If you like this video, please share it or subscribe to my channel, or leave a like. And if you have any curiosity, please feel free to ask, either in the comments or via email. When once again, I thank you for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.